A captured German order, distributed to troops dug in along the Mussolini Canal in the spring of 1944, contained an unusual instruction. The men were warned that they were now facing an elite Canadian and American force. The document described these soldiers as treacherous, unmerciful, and clever. It told the German rank and file that they could not afford to relax, and it offered a tangible reward. The first German soldier, or group of soldiers, to capture one of these men alive would be granted a 10-day furlough. A 10-day pass home, in the middle of one of the bloodiest stalemates of the war, for catching a single enemy soldier. That was the price the German command was prepared to pay just to put one of these men in front of an interrogator. These were not the words of Allied propaganda. They were not exaggerations from a war correspondent looking for a headline. They were instructions from a German staff officer to his own men, captured during the Anzio campaign and translated by Allied intelligence. And they were not written about the United States Army Rangers. They were not written about the British Commandos. They were written about a single, unusual unit of roughly 1,400 Canadians and Americans, dug in along a flooded canal, on the right flank of a beachhead. The world had largely forgotten. The Germans, or so the story has come down to us, had a private name for them, die schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils. Whether that name was first used by frightened German soldiers in the line, or whether it was a piece of psychological warfare seeded into the battlefield by the unit's own intelligence officers, is a question we will return to. What is not in dispute is what the Germans wrote in their own captured paperwork: treacherous, unmerciful, and clever. For the soldiers of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and the 715th Infantry Division, the war on the Anzio Plain in the early months of 1944 had a specific, narrow geography of fear. They feared American artillery, and they had reason to. They feared the British Spitfires that ruled the daytime sky. But when the sun went down over the Pontine marshes, and the wind came in cold off the Tyrrhenian Sea, and the no-man's land between the lines went silent, they feared something else entirely. They feared the men with blackened faces and stiletto knives, who came through the wire without a sound, who left small red arrowhead stickers on the bodies of the dead, and who, by the morning, had pushed the German front line back another 100 yards without firing a single shot anyone could hear. This is the story of a unit that the Allies had no idea what to do with. A unit raised for a mission that was cancelled before it ever fought. A unit that was half American, half Canadian, equipped with knives designed by its own commander, trained in a language nobody else used, and committed to ground that nobody else wanted. And it is the story of why, of all the special units the Western Allies fielded against the Wehrmacht, this one specific brigade earned a reputation that the Rangers and the Commandos, for all their courage, simply did not. To understand that distinction, we have to set aside the modern instinct to lump all elite units together. In 1944, the Allied Special Forces world was still being invented. The British had pioneered it, the Americans had copied it, and somewhere in between, in a snow-covered training camp in Helena, Montana, and a third experiment was running. The first Special Service Force. The German soldier dug in around the Mussolini Canal had a working hierarchy of his enemies. He feared American artillery and British air power for what they could do to him from a distance. Those were impersonal fears. Fears of machines. The fear of the Rangers had a different shape, and by February of 1944 it had largely faded. The Rangers had been spent at Cisterna on the last night of January, when 2 of the 3 battalions of Darby's Ranger force were ambushed in a drainage ditch and effectively destroyed in a single night's fighting. After that night, the Ranger force on the beachhead was finished. We will come back to what happened at Cisterna, because it explains a great deal about the difference between courage and survival in the Anzio campaign. The British Commandos came and went. Number 9 Commando and Number 43 Royal Marine Commando landed near Peter Beach in the opening hours of the Anzio assault, took some high ground, and were withdrawn within 4 days. Number 9 returned in March, conducted Operation X in the wadis along the western flank, took heavy casualties in a single action, and was pulled out again to refit. They were good. They were very good. But they were transient. The German troops opposite the British sector saw them, fought them, lost men to them, and then woke up one morning to find a different unit in their place. The first Special Service Force was different. It did not rotate. It did not raid and retreat. It arrived on the right flank of the beachhead on February 2, 1944, took over the line from the wreckage of the Ranger battalions and stayed there for 99 consecutive days. It held a frontage of approximately 13 kilometers, roughly 1/4 of the entire Anzio perimeter, with a force that on most days numbered somewhere between 1,200 and 1,700 men. By comparison, the 3rd United States Infantry Division held a sector of 7 kilometers with 10,000 men. That ratio alone tells you something, but it does not yet tell you why the Germans were afraid. The truth was buried in the way the force did its job. And to understand that, we have to go back to a Norwegian glacier and an English eccentric, and to a unit that was originally supposed to die on a mission that never happened. In March of 1942, a civilian scientist named Geoffrey Pyke walked into Combined Operations Headquarters in London with a proposal that should have been laughed out of the room. Pyke worked for Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Chief of Combined Operations. He proposed dropping a small force of specially trained commandos onto the Jostedalsbreen Glacier in occupied Norway, where they would use snow vehicles to destroy 14 Norwegian hydroelectric plants, supplying nearly half of Norway's electrical power. They would also destroy the heavy water production facility at Wehrmacht, which the British already suspected was feeding the German atomic program. The mission was to be called Project Plough. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a one-way operation. Mountbatten loved it. Churchill loved it. President Roosevelt's advisor Harry Hopkins loved it. General George Marshall, the United States Army Chief of Staff, accepted the project on April 11, 1942 at the Chequers Conference, and the responsibility for organizing it landed on the desk of a 35-year-old American lieutenant colonel named Robert Tryon Frederick. Frederick read the proposal. He drafted a 14-page assessment. His conclusion was that Project Plough was operationally impossible, and that the men sent to execute it would not return. Eisenhower, then heading the War Plans Division, listened to Frederick's argument and then told him that he was going to organize and command the unit anyway, because Churchill, Mountbatten, Roosevelt, and Marshall had already made up their minds. Frederick, who had never wanted the assignment, accepted it. On July 9, 1942, the 1st Special Service Force was activated at Fort William Henry Harrison, near Helena, Montana. Frederick was promoted to full colonel on the same day. The Norwegian mission was effectively cancelled within months. The Norwegian government in exile could not provide troops. The British had concluded by autumn of 1942 that the extraction phase was fanciful. And in February of 1943, Norwegian saboteurs of the Special Operations Executive, in Operation Gunnerside, accomplished the Wehrmacht mission that the force would have undertaken. The reason for the unit's existence had vanished before it had ever fought. But the force did not disband. Churchill argued for keeping it alive as a deception threat to the Germans. And in those months of training in Montana, with no real mission and no clear future, Frederick built something that none of the original planners had quite intended. He built one of the most thoroughly trained light infantry units of the entire war. The recruitment circular asked for single men, aged 21 to 35, with backgrounds as lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters, game wardens, prospectors, and explorers. The Canadians sent their best. The Americans sent a more mixed bag, and Frederick was not above accepting men whom American unit commanders had quietly placed in the stockades, on the theory that he could either break them or make them useful. Trains arriving at Helena had their windows blacked out to preserve the secrecy of the project. The men got off the trains in the Montana cold, were issued their kit, and within 48 hours they were jumping out of airplanes. There were no jump towers at Fort Harrison. The training cadre had to improvise. The standard for earning parachute wings was reduced to 2 jumps, instead of the 5 required at the parachute school at Fort Benning. 175 men in the early intake refused to jump and were cut from the unit. 80 more were eliminated by injury before the techniques were modified. Norwegian Army instructors, the only piece of the Norwegian contribution that ever materialized, taught cross-country skiing. The marching standard was 45 miles in 12 hours, carrying 60 pounds of equipment. The forced march course was 60 miles. The unit record, set by 1st Regiment, was 20 hours. Hand-to-hand combat was taught by a Canadian captain named Dermot Pat O'Neill, formerly a detective sergeant in the Shanghai Municipal Police. O'Neill had served in the same force as William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes, the legendary creators of the Fairbairn-Sykes commando knife. He was a fourth-degree Kodokan Judo black belt at the time, and the system he taught was a blend of Fairbairn's Defendu and his own innovations. Trainees fought one another with unsheathed bayonets. Injuries were common. Major Guy d'Artois, a French-Canadian, taught Savate, the French art of foot fighting. And then there was the knife. Frederick was not satisfied with any standard-issue blade. Working with O'Neill on the blade profile and with Major Orville Baldwin on the design of the pommel, he commissioned a custom fighting knife from W.R. Case and Sons of Bradford, Pennsylvania. It was officially designated Knife Fighting Commando Type V42. The designation was Case Cutlery's internal pattern number, though forcemen and historians since have sometimes glossed the V as standing for victory. The blade was 7 1/4 inches long, double hollow ground, narrow, made of high carbon blued steel. The handle was stacked leather with a thumb groove that oriented the edge horizontally for the thrust. The pommel was a pointed steel skull crusher, sharp enough that many forcemen filed it down to keep from injuring themselves while running. Somewhere between 3,000 and 3,400 of these knives were produced under 5 army contracts during the war, and they were issued only to combat echelon forcemen. The V-42 later became part of the official insignia of the United States Army Special Forces, where it remains today. The unit insignia was a red arrowhead. Across the top, in white block letters, it read USA. Down the side, vertically, it read Canada. The collar device was a pair of crossed arrows, a piece of regalia originally worn by the United States Army Indian Scouts in the 1890s. It was the only unit in the Allied order of battle that wore the badge of 2 nations on a single patch. The composition was unprecedented. The combat echelon was authorized at 1,800 men, divided roughly evenly between Canadian and American volunteers. The Canadian element was officially designated the 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion. They wore American uniforms, drew American rations, fought under a binational chain of command, and bled at the same rate as their American comrades. There was no other formation like it on either side of the war. Frederick led the unit's first parachute jump personally, in low quarter dress shoes because his jump boots had not arrived yet. That detail tells you most of what you need to know about him. He led from the front to a degree that bordered on reckless. He believed he could not ask his men to do what he would not do himself, and he proved it by being shot, hit by shrapnel, and crushed by debris on so many separate occasions that he ended the war with 8 Purple Hearts. 3 of them came on a single day, June 4, 1944, in the streets of Rome. It was an unprecedented total for a single day in the United States Army. The force trained for 18 months. By the autumn of 1943, it was a finished weapon looking for a target, and in November of that year, with the Italian campaign grinding to a halt in front of the German Bernhardt Line, Mark Clark's Fifth Army gave it one. The target was Monte la Difensa. Difensa was a peak in the Camino Hill Mass, west of the Mignano Gap, and it was the left gatepost of the German defensive line south of Cassino. The Germans considered the northeast cliff face of Difensa to be impassable. They had defended the southern approaches in November and watched a 10-day attack by the United States 7th Infantry break itself against the slopes. They expected any further attempt to come up the same ground. On the night of December 2, 1943, in freezing rain, the 2nd Regiment of the force climbed the cliff the Germans had not bothered to defend. They went up in the dark, tied to one another with ropes, hauling weapons and ammunition up sheer rock that in places rose almost vertically for 300 meters. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McWilliam, a 28-year-old officer from New Brunswick, led the attacking battalion. They reached the depression below the German position around midnight. Loose gravel betrayed them. The Germans fired flares. The firefight began. It was over in roughly 2 hours. Fifth Army planners had projected that the position would take 4 to 5 days. McWilliam was killed by mortar fire on the summit. Captain William Rothlin was killed in close fighting at the German position, in circumstances that several force accounts describe as the Germans feigning surrender. Frederick himself was wounded when a mortar round drove a rock into his back, and he covered another wounded soldier with his own body to shield him from a second blast. By the morning of December 3, the summit was in Allied hands, and the force began 6 days of holding the peak under continuous artillery bombardment from the surrounding German positions. Casualties for the Defensa and Remitania operations together, December 2 to 9, came to 511 men out of an attacking strength that had begun the operation at less than 1,500 effective combat troops. 73 killed, 313 wounded, 9 missing, and 116 evacuated for frostbite, trench foot, or sheer exhaustion. Sergeant Joe Glass, a Canadian from Sarnia who was severely wounded on the mountain, gave it a name the survivors would use for the rest of their lives. They called it the $1 Million Mountain. The force fought through Hill 720 on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. It assaulted Monte Maggio from the night of January 6 into January 9, breaking through German counterattacks that came at it more than 25 times on the first day alone, and over 40 times across the 2 days that followed. When ammunition ran out, forcemen fired captured German weapons. By the time the unit came out of the Italian mountains in mid-January, fewer than 500 effective combat troops remained out of an original strength of approximately 1,800. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gilday, by then the senior Canadian officer in the force, formally requested that the Canadian element be withdrawn. The recommendation went up the chain of command and was not adopted. The orders that came down instead, on January 29, were to embark for Anzio. The Anzio beachhead in early February of 1944 was a frozen, flooded disaster. The American 6th Corps had landed on January 22, achieved complete surprise, and then halted to consolidate. By the time the Corps commander was ready to advance, the Germans had moved 14 divisions to ring the beachhead, and the Allied force was effectively trapped in a perimeter only 15 miles wide. The Germans held the high ground. They held the dry ground. The Allies held a strip of reclaimed marsh, dominated by German artillery observers in the Alban Hills, and they were taking casualties at a rate that the planners had not anticipated. The geography of the Anzio plain mattered enormously to what happened next. The land had been swamp until the 1930s, when Mussolini's regime drained it as part of a vast public works program. The drainage left behind a grid of straight canals, raised farm roads, scattered stone farmhouses, and irrigation ditches running everywhere. There were no woods to hide in. There was no high ground to hold. The water table sat just below the surface, so that any foxhole dug deeper than 2 feet filled with cold groundwater within hours. The men in the line lived wet and cold. Trench foot was as serious an enemy as German shrapnel. The Germans, looking down from the foothills of the Alban range, could see the entire beachhead on a clear day. And on cloudy days, the artillery observers worked from spotter aircraft and from infiltrated forward parties hidden in the abandoned farms. For an attacker, this was terrible ground. For an aggressive raiding force, it was perfect. The flat fields meant that a small group of men, moving in the dark, could cover distance fast. The drainage ditches gave concealment to a soldier willing to wade through freezing water in silence. The straight canals could be crossed at night with a rope and a pair of inflated rubber bladders. And the German line, stretched thin around a 52-kilometre perimeter, was held in many places not by continuous trenches but by isolated platoon strongpoints in fortified farmhouses, with gaps between them that an experienced patrol could find and exploit. The force landed at 1000 hours on February 1. By the next day, February 2, it had taken over the right flank of the beachhead from what was left of the 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions after Cisterna. The sector ran roughly 13 kilometres along the Mussolini Canal, the largest of the anti-tank ditches running across the reclaimed plain, up to 60 yards wide at its widest point. To the right was the Tyrrhenian Sea. To the front, across the canal, was the German Hermann Göring Panzer Division. The German order of battle opposite the Mussolini Canal sector was not a static thing. It rotated. In the opening weeks, the principal opponent was the 1st Parachute Panzer Division, Hermann Göring, under the command of Colonel Paul Conrath, an experienced officer who had taken the division through Tunisia and Sicily. As the campaign ground on, the Germans pulled the Hermann Göring out for refit and committed the 715th Infantry Division, a hastily motorized formation that had been shipped up from southern France in late January. The 362nd Infantry Division held adjoining ground near Cisterna and was effectively destroyed in the breakout battles of late May. By March, an Italian fascist battalion of the Italian Social Republic, the Decima Flottiglia MAS Barbarigo Battalion, had been inserted into the line along the canal, meaning that some of the killed and captured on this sector were not Germans at all but Italian collaborators fighting for Mussolini's rump regime in the north. What this rotation meant in practice was that fresh German troops kept arriving on the canal, and each fresh German unit had to learn for itself what holding that sector against the men with the red arrowhead patches actually involved. The legend did not have to spread on its own. It was reintroduced, in person and in violence, to every new battalion that came forward to relieve the last one. The force was ordered to hold the line. What its commanders did instead was make the Germans wish they were holding it from a great deal further away. On the very first night, Frederick instituted a policy of aggressive patrolling. The official campaign history of the United States Army records what happened next, and the wording is worth quoting precisely. After a week of aggressive patrolling, the enemy had been forced back 1,500 yards, leaving a broad no-man's land between the opposing forces. During the day, this area appeared to be a peaceful expanse of level farmland. At night, the 1st Special Service Force kept it alive with hard-hitting patrols which gave the enemy no rest. That is the center of military history speaking, not a veteran's memoir, not a unit history, the official army historian's verdict. In 7 days, with somewhere around 1,400 men on the line, the force had pushed an entrenched German division back nearly a mile without conducting a single set-piece battle. Inside the sector itself, the forcemen quickly stopped using Italian place names for their forward positions and substituted their own. The hamlet of Borgo Sabatino became Gusville, named after Lieutenant Gus Heilmann of 1st Regiment, who set up his command post there. A farmhouse used as a forward observation point on the right of the line was renamed Cabbage Castle because of the rotting cabbages still hanging on stalks in the kitchen garden. Heilmann, who had run a bar in civilian life called the Cavalier, opened an unofficial bar of his own in Gusville for the men coming off patrol. Forcemen traded, captured German watches and pistols for whiskey. The bar operated for the duration of the campaign. The mechanism was night patrolling, and it became the unit's signature. Forcemen blackened their faces with American Army-issue boot polish. Some used cork, some used grease. They went out in small teams, often 6 to 10 men, sometimes fewer. They wore moccasins or wrapped boots. Sergeant Tommy Prince, an Ojibway soldier from Brokenhead First Nation in Manitoba, habitually wore moccasins on patrol. They carried the V-42 stiletto, the Johnson light machine gun, the Thompson submachine gun, and grenades. They infiltrated through the German wire. They took prisoners. They killed sentries silently, with the knife in the throat, and on the bodies of the dead, and inside the dugouts they cleared, they left small adhesive stickers, designed personally by Frederick, bearing the red arrowhead of the force, and a single line of German text printed in red. Das dicke Ende kommt noch. It is a German proverb, and it does not translate cleanly into English. Literally, it means the thick end is still coming. Idiomatically, it means the worst is yet to come, drawn from the image of a stick whose heavy end strikes last. Original specimens of those stickers survive today. The Montana Military Museum holds one. So do private collections of veterans' families. One sticker, kept in the personal effects of a forceman from 3rd Company, 3rd Regiment, came with a handwritten note that read simply, "Stickers we used to scare the Tedeschi." Tedeschi was the Italian word for Germans. This was not folklore. This was deliberate, institutional, calculated psychological warfare, run out of Frederick's headquarters as a unit policy. On the night of February 8 to 9, just 1 week into the deployment, 2nd Company of the 2nd Regiment raided the village of Cisterna, held by a German company on the force's left front. The center of military history records the action in plain prose. The German company holding Cisterna was almost annihilated. 7 prisoners taken, at least 40 Germans killed. The village held for 3 hours. The raiders withdrew before dawn. That was 1 company, 1 night, 1 raid, on a sector that the force was supposed to be merely defending. There were prisoner snatch raids too, and they were the single most valuable form of intelligence that the Anzio beachhead produced. On the night of March 14, 1st Lieutenant Mark Radcliffe led a small patrol across the canal looking for a live German to bring back for interrogation. The patrol made contact, was overrun, and Radcliffe was captured and bound. He was taken to a German command post at Litoria, interrogated by an officer of the Hermann Göring Division, and held with 2 other Allied escapees, 1 British and 1 French. On the 3rd night, during an Allied artillery barrage that distracted his guards, Radcliffe broke free, struck a guard with a piece of wood, and slipped out of the building with his fellow prisoners. They hid the next day inside an evergreen tree as German patrols searched for them, then travelled by night across the broken country toward the canal. He was found by a force patrol under Sergeant Big Swede Eriksson and brought back across the line. He had been wounded by mortar shrapnel in the foot and near the eyes during the escape. His debrief produced more usable intelligence on German dispositions in the Cisterna area than the Allied beachhead had received in the previous month from any other source. It is during these first weeks at Anzio that Sergeant Tommy Prince, attached as a forward observer to the 1st Battalion of the 3rd Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Tom Gilday, executed the action that would bring him the military medal. Prince was a sniper, a scout, and an extraordinarily patient observer. He was great-grandson of Chief Pegis. He spoke Ojibway, English, and enough Italian to pass in conversation. He was 28 years old. On February 8th, near the German-held town of Litoria, Prince ran 1,400 metres of telephone wire forward from the Allied lines to an abandoned farmhouse, roughly 200 metres from the German positions. From the upstairs window of the farmhouse, he had a clear view of 4 German artillery emplacements. He spent roughly 24 hours in the building, calling fire corrections back over the wire. At some point during the day, German shelling cut the line. What Prince did next has been retold so often that it sounds invented, but it was witnessed and recorded in his official citation. He went down to the ground floor of the house. He took off his uniform jacket and put on civilian clothes that had been left in the farmhouse, the clothes of an Italian peasant. He picked up a hoe, and he walked out of the front door, in plain sight of the German positions, and he began to weed the field between the house and the wire. He found the break in the line. He bent down as if to tie his shoelaces. He spliced the wire. He stood up, shook his fist theatrically at the German lines, then turned and shook his fist at the Allied lines, played the part of an angry farmer who had had enough of foreigners on his land, and walked back into the farmhouse. The fire mission was completed. 4 German artillery emplacements were destroyed. Prince's military medal was presented to him personally by King George VI at Buckingham Palace on February 12, 1945. Later that same year, in southern France, he would earn the United States Silver Star for a separate action, making him one of only 3 Canadians of the Second World War to hold both decorations. This is what the Mussolini Canal sector was like, night after night, for 99 consecutive nights. It is here that the comparison to the other Allied special units becomes precise, because the difference is not one of courage. It is one of structure, mission, and time. The United States Army Rangers were good. Darby's Rangers had spearheaded the landings at Gela in Sicily. They had fought at Salerno. They were trained on the commando model by the commandos themselves in Northern Ireland in 1942. But by the time of Anzio, the Rangers had been used and used again as conventional infantry, in roles their training had not been designed for. At Cisterna, on the night of January 30, 2 battalions of 767 men were ordered to infiltrate by night down a drainage ditch and seize a town that Allied intelligence had assessed as defended by a thin screen of outposts. The intelligence was wrong. The Germans had concentrated 5 divisions in the area, including the same Hermann Göring formation that the force would soon face. By daybreak, the Rangers were caught on open ground. 6 men returned to friendly lines. The force absorbed approximately 400 Ranger replacements when it took over the sector. The 66th 15th Ranger Force was officially disbanded on August 15, 1944. Colonel William Darby, the Rangers' commander, never served with conventional infantry by choice. After Cisterna, he took command of the 179th Infantry Regiment, then served as assistant commander of the 10th Mountain Division. He was killed by a German artillery shell at Torbole, on Lake Garda, on April 30, 1945, just 2 days before the German surrender in Italy. He is widely cited as the only United States officer of the Second World War to be posthumously promoted to general officer rank. The story of the Rangers at Anzio is not a story of failure of courage. It is a story of how the Allied command failed to understand the difference between elite light infantry and a deep penetration raiding force. The British Commandos were also good. They were arguably the best raiding troops in the European theatre, but their model by 1944 was the short raid and the spearhead landing. Number 9 Commando came ashore at Anzio on the opening night, took some high ground, and was withdrawn within 4 days. Number 43 Royal Marine Commando was alongside them and rotated out at the same time. Number 9 returned in March, conducted Operation X in the wadis on the western flank, and lost 73 men killed, wounded, or missing in that single action before being pulled out again. The commandos were transient by design. Their job was to land, hit, and leave. There was also a deliberate difference in how each unit was used by its higher headquarters. Mark Clark's Fifth Army, frustrated at the Anzio stalemate, and aware that the force was simply better at night work than any other unit on the beachhead, gave Frederick a degree of operational latitude in his sector that was unusual for a brigade-sized formation. He did not need to clear individual patrol plans. He set the policy, and his regimental commanders executed it. The Rangers and the Commandos worked under tighter operational leashes because their actions were tied to specific phase lines on broader corps and army plans. The 1st Special Service Force was something the Allied Special Operations world had not yet built. It was a permanent, sector-holding, aggressive raiding formation. It did the job of conventional infantry. It also did the job of deep raiders. It did both at once, on the same ground, against the same enemy, every single night for over 3 months. That is the structural fact behind the Black Devil's legend. It is also why the legend attached to the force, and not to its sister units. The Germans across the Mussolini Canal saw the same red arrowhead patches, the same blackened faces, the same calling card stickers, the same V-42 knife wounds in the throats of their sentries, for 99 consecutive nights. By the 3rd week, that rotation of nightly experience had circulated through every German company in the sector. By the 2nd month, it had reached battalion and regimental headquarters. By the 3rd, it had become the local truth of what it meant to hold the right flank. And it is here that we have to be honest about the most famous part of the legend, because the truth of it matters more than the myth. The story goes that forcemen on a night patrol near Anzio recovered, from the body of a German officer, a personal diary. Inside, in a hand the dead man would never write again, were words that would echo down the decades. The Black Devils are all around us every time we come into the line. We never hear them come. It is a beautiful piece of writing, and there is almost nothing about it that can be verified. The story first appears in print in 1947, in a unit history written by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Burhans. Burhans had been the senior intelligence officer of the force at Anzio. The captured diary, in other words, was first reported by the very office that would have processed any such document, and the very office that would have had the strongest motive to manufacture a useful piece of psychological warfare narrative. No German-language original of the entry has ever surfaced. No identification of the dead officer has ever been provided. No date has ever been attached. No reference to the captured document appears in any surviving Fifth Army intelligence summary, in any German divisional war diary in the Bundesarchiv, or in the post-war memoirs of Albert Kesselring, Eberhard von Mackensen, Siegfried Westphal, or any of the other German generals who actually commanded at Anzio. None of those 4 men, in their own published accounts of the campaign, mention the 1st Special Service Force at all. The 1st Special Service Force Association itself, in its own historical statements, acknowledges that this legend was never verified as fact by any member of the force. What we do have, what is documented, is the captured German order quoted at the start of this video: treacherous, unmerciful, and clever. The 10-day furlough for any man who could capture one alive. That document is referenced consistently across the entire force's historical record. We have the Center of Military History's own account of the 1,500-yard German pullback in 7 days. We have the casualty figures from the Cisterna raid. We have the surviving stickers in the museums. We have the Ranger and Commando comparisons in the war diaries. We do not have the diary. And the truth is that the force does not need the diary. The verifiable record is more than enough. Across 99 days on the Mussolini Canal, the 1st Special Service Force suffered approximately 384 killed, wounded, or missing. 117 of those casualties were Canadian. 62 Canadian forcemen are buried at the Beachhead War Cemetery at Anzio. The unit's combat strength on the line fluctuated between roughly 1,200 and 1,700 men. They were ground down by a campaign that the planners had expected to wrap up in weeks, and that ran instead for over 4 months. When the Anzio breakout finally came, on May 23, 1944, the force went over to the offensive. After 99 days holding the right flank, it was now driving along it. It took Monte Arestino on May 25, took Rocca Massima on May 27, and took Colleferro on June 2. Then the race for Rome. Frederick was tasked with capturing 6 bridges across the Tiber intact. The Germans were rigging them for demolition. A hand-picked patrol of 3 sergeants under Captain Mark Radcliffe, including Staff Sergeant K.R.S. Meiklejohn of Edmonton, slipped into the city through the Porta San Giovanni on the Via Tuscolana before dawn on the morning of June 4. They were among the first Allied troops into Rome from the south, in a converging Allied advance that included other reconnaissance elements approaching from different directions. Frederick himself led the larger bridge-securing operation and was wounded 3 times in the course of that one day. The citation for his 2nd Distinguished Service Cross records the action in detail. By nightfall, the bridges were in Allied hands. Force headquarters was established in the United States Embassy on the Via Veneto. 2 days later, the world's attention turned to Normandy, and the Anzio campaign, and the force that had held its right flank, were largely forgotten by the public on both sides of the Atlantic. There were 3 more months of fighting. On August 15, 1944, in Operation Sitka, the force made silent amphibious landings on the Ile du Levant and the Ile de Port-Cross off the southern French coast, roughly 6.5 hours ahead of the main Operation Dragoon landings. The German garrison on Port-Cross, in Napoleonic-era stone forts, held out until August 17 under naval bombardment. On the Ile du Levant, the supposed coastal battery turned out to be wooden logs painted to look like guns, the originals having been removed during the French scuttling at Toulon nearly 2 years earlier. The force took roughly 110 prisoners on the islands at a cost of about 60 casualties. It was during this period, on September 1, that Tommy Prince executed the 70-kilometre reconnaissance patrol behind German lines that would earn him his Silver Star. The force was disbanded in a field on the Loup River Flats at Villeneuve-Loubet in southern France on December 5, 1944, almost exactly 1 year after the assault that had carried it to the summit of Monte la Difensa. The reasons were structural. Canada's volunteer overseas army was running out of trained infantry replacements after the casualties of Normandy and Italy. Frederick himself, in a letter written in February of that year and now held in the Hoover Institution archives, had argued that the unit should be allowed to pass out of existence while it was still in its prime, rather than be sustained through a period in which it would be remembered only for its faults. The disbandment ceremony, by the testimony of every veteran who recorded it, was the most emotional moment of their war. The Canadian element, smaller than the American by the end, marched past the assembled American forcemen in a final pass in review, eyes right. The Americans rendered honors. The 2 halves of the brigade, who had trained together in Montana, jumped together, climbed Defensa together, blackened their faces together, and held the Mussolini Canal together for 99 consecutive days, then split forever. Most Canadians went on to the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, which would jump across the Rhine in March of 1945. Many of the Americans were folded into the new 474th Infantry Regiment, which, in an irony that history could not have invented, served occupation duty in Norway. Others went as paratrooper replacements to the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions for the final battles in Germany. The final tallies, certified by the Congressional Gold Medal documentation of 2013, give a brigade that fought for 251 days in combat, suffered casualties equal to 134% of its authorized combat strength, inflicted approximately 12,000 enemy casualties, and took thousands of prisoners, with figures cited at the official commemorations ranging from 7,000 in the unit's own records to over 30,000 in some later accounts. 5 United States Campaign Stars, 9 Canadian Battle Honours, now carried on the Regimental Standard of the Canadian Special Operations Regiment. The legacy is what makes the story unfinished. In 1952, Colonel Aaron Bank stood up the 10th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He drew explicitly on the force's lessons in unconventional, mountain, cold weather, and behind-the-lines warfare. The 1st Special Forces, the parent regiment of the modern American Special Forces, he was reconstituted in the regular army in 1960 and formally redesignated as the 1st Special Forces Regiment in 2005, formally inheriting the force's lineage. The arrowhead shape of the force's shoulder patch was echoed in the Special Forces distinctive unit insignia, approved on August 22, 1955. The V-42 stiletto, the knife Frederick designed in Montana, sits at the center of that insignia today. In 1983, the United States Army made the force the only unit of the Second World War whose veterans were retroactively eligible for the Special Forces tab. In Canada, the Canadian Special Operations Regiment was stood up at Canadian Forces Base, Petawawa, on August 13, 2006. It was constituted to formally perpetuate the battle honours of the 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion, the force's Canadian element. On December 5, 2024, the 80th anniversary of the force's disbandment, Governor-General Mary Simon presented the regiment with its first Regimental Standard, emblazoned with the force's battle honours. The cap badge of the Canadian Special Operations Regiment incorporates the V-42 stiletto and the crossed arrows of the force. The regimental drink is whiskey, in honour of an order Frederick is said to have placed for whiskey resupply on the summit of Monte la Difensa. Tommy Prince served 2 further tours in Korea, the first with the 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, including the Battle of Kapyong in April of 1951, and a second tour the following year with the 3rd Battalion of the same regiment. He died in poverty at Deer Lodge Hospital, Winnipeg, on November 25, 1977. He held 11 medals. There is now a memorial to him in Kildonan Park, a veterans' park named for him at 100 Battery Street, a school that bears his name at Brokenhead Ojibway Nation, and a Canada Post stamp unveiled on October 17, 2022, and issued for sale 11 days later. The Manitoba Museum holds 10 of his 11 medals in trust for his family. Of the original combat strength of approximately 1,800 forcemen who passed through Helena, Montana in 1942 and 1943, only a handful are still alive. The annual reunions, once held in Helena and Calgary in rooms full of veterans, are now small. The youngest Canadian forcemen, 18 years old, at enlistment in 1942, are now over 100. What they leave behind is not a Hollywood legend, even if Hollywood made the film. It is a verifiable, documented record of what happens when you take roughly 1,400 volunteers from 2 countries, train them harder than anyone else trains light infantry in the Western Allied order of battle, give them a commander who refuses to ask anything of them that he will not do himself, and hand them a sector of the line that the conventional planners have written off. You get the Mussolini Canal. You get a 1,500-yard German pullback in a week. You get a captured order describing your soldiers as treacherous, unmerciful, and clever, with a 10-day furlough offered for any one of them brought in alive. That is why the Germans feared the 1st Special Service Force at Anzio, in a way they did not fear the Rangers or the Commandos, not because the force was braver. The Rangers were brave. The Commandos were brave. Not because the force was better trained. All 3 were superbly trained. The reason was simpler and harder. The force did not leave. It arrived, it took over the worst sector on the beachhead, and it stayed there for 99 consecutive nights, doing the same patient, lethal, signature work, with the same blackened faces and the same red stickers and the same knife in the dark, until the Germans on the other side of the canal stopped sleeping. Some captured documents survive, some do not. The legendary diary entry, the line about the black devils being all around them, has never been produced as a real piece of paper. But we do not need it. The order is enough. The furlough is enough. Nobody ever collected it.